On September 7, 2021, the world stopped for a moment. The tiny Central American nation of El Salvador made history when it became the first country to pass a law making Bitcoin legal tender alongside the US dollar. Was this a bold move to embrace the future of finance and usher in an era of financial inclusion for the unbanked masses? Or was it a reckless experiment that would turn out to be a disaster? That is what we'll find out in this series, where we'll follow the Bitcoin revolution in El Salvador from its origin to its current state. In today's episode, we'll cover the motivation behind the adoption, the initial reactions from around the world, and the early reaction in El Salvador itself, before moving on to the implementation in the next episode. So let's get it. Before the Bitcoin law, El Salvador's president, Nayib Bukele, had already been laying the groundwork. The centerpiece of his plan was an official government wallet called Chivo, which is slang for cool in El Salvador. Every citizen would get $30 if they downloaded the wallet. Not only would this incentivize people to adopt the new currency, but it would also lay the foundation for a digital ID system, which he believed would drive financial inclusion. El Salvador had two main reasons for adopting Bitcoin. The first was to reduce the cost of remittances. As we mentioned in our previous video, many Salvadorans living abroad send money back home to their families. And currently, the fees are exorbitant. The government is betting that Bitcoin can reduce these costs and put more money in the hands of ordinary people. If successful, this would be revolutionary since millions of people around the world depend on remittances. However, the second reason is much more controversial. By adopting Bitcoin, El Salvador was taking a step away from the US dollar, which they currently peg their currency to. Right now, the Salvadoran economy is highly dependent on the United States. Approximately 20% of their GDP comes from remittances sent by Americans employed in the United States. In addition, almost everything else is imported from the US and requires dollars. This dependence makes them vulnerable to changes in US monetary policy. So Bitcoin could help them gain more control over their own destiny. In addition to these two main reasons, there was a third, less tangible one. Since the government would effectively be dipping their toes into the world of cryptocurrency, they hoped that it would attract investment and entrepreneurship from the booming industry. Now that we know why El Salvador adopted Bitcoin, let's see how the world reacted. The news was mostly met with skepticism from large organizations. The International Monetary Fund warned that the adoption of Bitcoin could lead to a loss of control over monetary policy, a rise in illicit activities, and threats to financial stability. The World Bank warned of similar things and said that the complicated nature of Bitcoin makes it difficult to reverse. Traditional economists were quick to speak up as well. Some pointed out that Bitcoin's price was too volatile to be used for everyday transactions. Others argued that the country didn't have the necessary infrastructure to support Bitcoin. Many also accused Bukele of using the Bitcoin law as a publicity stunt and questioned his motives. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the crypto community responded much more positively to the news. For many Bitcoin maximalists, this was a sign that the world was finally waking up to the potential of cryptocurrency. Now, some went as far as to call El Salvador the new Switzerland because of how closely it mirrors how Bitcoin was received in the country. And what was the reaction in El Salvador itself? While the reaction from large institutions and governments was fairly uniform, the reaction inside El Salvador was much more mixed. Many were excited at the prospect of having another currency that could help them earn more money and become financially free from the US. But others were concerned about the risk that Bitcoin could bring. There were several protests in San Salvador where people held up signs saying things like "No more Bitcoin" and "Don't gamble with our economy." A group of women demonstrated outside the Legislative Assembly building in the capital city, holding a banner that read, "They're giving away our economy as if it were a game." Many protesters felt left out of the decision-making process and worried about how they would be able to keep up with a currency that was constantly fluctuating in value. This brings us to an interesting point. The average salary in El Salvador is just under $400 a month. The lowest denomination of Bitcoin is called a Satoshi and is worth 1/100th millionth of a Bitcoin. At the time of writing, one Bitcoin is worth about $65,000. So one Bitcoin is equivalent to 4 billion Satoshes. The smallest amount of Bitcoin that someone could legally tender in El Salvador is 0.00005 Bitcoin, or 25,000 Satoshes, which is worth roughly 16 cents at the time of recording. So based on this, how will people actually use Bitcoin? What if someone needs to buy groceries for exactly 48 cents? They would need to pull out almost 1 million Satoshes. But the thing is, most people in El Salvador don't know anything about Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies in general. So how are they supposed to navigate something so complicated? The answer, unfortunately, is they won't. It'll be up to the government and companies that choose to adopt Bitcoin to do all the complicated stuff so that ordinary people can just use it like any other currency. If the government wants to convince people to adopt Bitcoin, they need to make it easy, simple, and beneficial to use. This leads us to our final question for today. How did El Salvador start implementing the Bitcoin law? Just 5 days after the law was passed, the government announced that they would be installing 200 Bitcoin ATMs around the country. These machines would allow people to buy Bitcoin with cash and sell Bitcoin back to cash. It seems like a pretty straightforward solution to getting a new currency into the hands of the people. But there were a lot of problems behind the scenes. The government also launched the beta version of the Chivo wallet. And as we mentioned earlier, every citizen would get $30 if they signed up. This part of the rollout was fairly successful. Around 3.5 million wallets were created, accounting for around half the population. One of the biggest questions surrounding the Bitcoin law was how the government planned to use it. Well, the answer came sooner than anyone expected. A few weeks after the law was passed, the government bought 400 Bitcoin, worth around $21 million at the time. Given that Bitcoin's price was fluctuating around $65,000 at the time, each Bitcoin cost $62,500. A few days later, the government bought another 150 Bitcoin. However, they didn't stop there. On September 20th, the day before the Bitcoin law went into effect, they made two massive purchases. First, they bought 100 Bitcoin for $6,500,500. Then about 12 hours later, they made another purchase of 100 Bitcoin, bringing the total to $6,500,500. These purchases alone account for 75% of all the Bitcoin they've bought. The timing of the purchases raises some eyebrows as Bitcoin's price shot up 9% in the 12 hours between the two purchases. This suggests that someone inside the government knew the price would go up and acted accordingly. But not everyone was so lucky. Shortly after the launch, many Salvadorans started complaining that the Chivo wallet wasn't working properly. Businesses were unable to accept Bitcoin payments, and users were unable to transfer money. There were even reports of people being unable to access the money in their own wallets. This led to a situation where hardly anyone wanted to use the currency. Shoppers couldn't buy things with it, and store owners couldn't get rid of it. This means that Bitcoin spent most of its first week in circulation barely being used at all. And that's where we'll leave off for this episode. Unfortunately, the early days of the Bitcoin rollout weren't very smooth. But we'll discuss what happened next in the next episode. Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed this video. If you have not, remember to like, share, subscribe, and put on the notification bell for more. We'll see you next time.